Hi. Okay, so today we're all going to do drugs together. We're going to do a lecture about drugs now, drugs and neurotransmitters. What did you think I was going to talk about? Okay. The kind of drugs that we're talking about today are psychoactive drugs. And psychoactive drugs are psychoactive because they affect our brain, our psyche, our mind. They are active there. And if they are affecting our brain, these drugs, that means that they can affect any part of our experience, our sensory experience, our perceptual experience, our moods and feelings, our cognitions, and our behaviors. The way that psychoactive drugs do that is by getting past the blood-brain barrier. Remember that earlier in the semester, we talked about the blood-brain barrier making it so that large molecules cannot cross the bloodstream into the brain. They cannot cross through the capillaries and get into the brain because of the tight junctures in the capillaries. But there are certain substances that are small enough to get in there, and you know them because they're famous for being able to affect our brains. Things like alcohol, things like cocaine, things like ecstasy, all of these drugs that you hear about, from heroin to marijuana and everything in between, we're talking about psychoactive drugs, drugs that can cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, there are medicines that can have an effect on your mood or decrease your pain in other ways. So for example, there's medicines that you can take over the counter like Motrin or Aleve, or these are ibuprofen, naproxen. Not trying to sell any different kinds of medicines here. I'm just giving you some names, brand names of these things. Those drugs don't cross the blood-brain barrier. Instead, what they do is they're called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or you may see on the bottle NSAIDs for short. And these drugs are actually able to reduce the inflammation in your tissues. And by reducing the inflammation in your body tissues, it takes pressure away, and that brings pain relief, and pain relief brings a better mood. So those things do affect your brain in kind of a secondary way, by making you more comfortable, by decreasing the actual swelling at the site that you might have an injury or something. But psychoactive drugs actually cross the blood-brain barrier and go into the brain and affect the brain. So they may or may not have any effect on making the rest of the body better, but they do certainly have an effect on your brain. So when at the end of action potential, okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about today, ways that psychoactive drugs affect our brain and behavior. And they do that by affecting neurotransmission. So that's going to be the first thing we talk about. Neurotransmission is the end goal of action potential, as I've said many times. Action potential is a electrochemical process. The electro part is when we're building up the charge to go towards action potential, and the chemical part is releasing the neurotransmitter at the end of the action potential. So neurotransmitters are chemicals, and psychoactive drugs affect neurotransmitters. They do different things to neurotransmitters, and that's how they have their effect. But it's not just one thing you can do to a neurotransmitter if you're a drug. Different drugs work in different ways, and we're going to talk about that right now. When the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor site on the postsynaptic cell, it opens up an ion channel and ions come in. And the ions that come in can be negative, or the ions that come in can be positive, depending on the kind of neurotransmitter and the kind of receptor. But what the drug does is it works on that neurotransmission process in some way. It can affect the production of neurotransmitter. It can either make your cells make more neurotransmitter or less neurotransmitter. It can affect the release of the neurotransmitter. It can make the presynaptic cell release more or less neurotransmitter. It can have different actions on the postsynaptic receptors. So for example, it can make it so that the neurotransmitter has an easier time binding to its receptor, or it can completely gum up the receptor entirely, like a piece of gum in a lock, and make it so that the neurotransmitter can't dock. So all of these different things can happen. You can increase or decrease reuptake. Now, I say this because theoretically it's possible to increase or decrease reuptake, but the drugs that we have so far only decrease reuptake. We don't have any drugs that we use that increase reuptake. And finally, a neurotransmitter can, or a psychoactive drug can pretend that it is a neurotransmitter and actually act as a ligand for the receptor and activate the receptor itself as if it were the neurotransmitter. So any of those different things can happen. So I kind of just wanted to get you oriented with this picture of the areas that we're talking about. So here we have, because people have been asking about this in class, here we have a bunch of different neurons talking to each other. We have one neuron here, then another neuron here, another here, another here, and then we have the synapse between these two neurons blown up real big so that you can see one axon terminal and one dendrite with the receptors in it. So when we talk about the presynaptic cell or the postsynaptic cell, it's relative to whatever synapse we're talking about. So if we were talking about that synapse right there, this would be the presynaptic cell and that would be the postsynaptic cell. But if we're talking about this synapse right here, then this is the presynaptic cell and that's the postsynaptic cell. So which cell's presynaptic and postsynaptic depends on which synapse we're talking about. We're just talking the presynaptic cell is the one that releases the neurotransmitter, and the postsynaptic cell is the one that receives the neurotransmitter in any area. And most neurons are both. Okay. So last time when I was talking about the different things that enzymes can do, one of the things that I mentioned was the second messenger system and how you can tell the DNA of the cell to make more or less of some kind of protein or structure. So like I said, I like to show this little video because it really highlights that the cell is like a city of activity. And this is depicting an actual real structure in your neurons and other cells of your body called a motor protein. And this particular motor protein right here, and it has little feet and it has little arms, is carrying a large vesicle full of neurotransmitter. And it's taking that somewhere to be used elsewhere in the cell. And it's walking that neurotransmitter down a microtubule. A microtubule acts like a little highway for this little motor protein to take that neurotransmitter where it needs to go. And I have a video of him actually doing that. Okay, go little motor protein, do your thing. Can you figure out how to make this play from here to there? Don't stop it. Just IT guy me. How do I get that to be up on the screen?
Let's get a video issue.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Back that up. Okay, so here's the little motor protein right there, walking that vesicle full of neurotransmitter down that microtubule to its destination in the cell. That's literally happening. This little badass protein is doing this in your body, walking himself like a boss where he needs to go to get his job done. So the structure of the cell is incredibly complex, and these are just some of the things that are happening in there. Okay, now let me get back to my slides. There we go. Okay. Okay, so at the very end, oh, this is showing the display again. I don't want it like that. Okay, thank you.
Press the PowerPoint icon.
Ah, that's not on my screen. Look. Okay. Okay, so at the very end, we talked about all of these different ways that drugs can affect neurotransmitters. It can increase or decrease production, increase or decrease release. It can have various actions on the postsynaptic receptors to either block them or facilitate binding. And it can increase or decrease reuptake. But right now, we don't have any known drugs that actually increase reuptake, just the kind that decrease reuptake. Now I'm going to talk about the agonist versus antagonist effects of neurotransmitters. Okay, so this is really, really important to understand. These words are used to describe any kind of drug. So you talk about a drug as being an agonist or an antagonist of a certain neurotransmitter. So you could have a dopamine agonist or a glutamate antagonist. You could have a serotonin agonist, or you could have a norepinephrine antagonist. My point is that you are an agonist of some kind of neurotransmitter or an antagonist of some kind of neurotransmitter. You're not an agonist of a cell. You're not an agonist of a neuron. You're not an agonist of action potential. You're not an agonist of resting potential. You're an agonist or an antagonist, if you're a psychoactive drug, you're an agonist or antagonist of a neurotransmitter. An agonist of a neurotransmitter increases the effect of the neurotransmitter. So can you point at that over there? Drugs that are agonists of a neurotransmitter increase the effect of that neurotransmitter. So if you hear that a drug is a dopamine agonist, that means it increases the effect of dopamine. If you hear that a drug is I'm just making things up off the top of my head, serotonin antagonist, that means it decreases the effect of serotonin, the neurotransmitter. It has nothing to do with whether the effect on the cell is to push the cell toward or away from action potential. That depends on what kind of neurotransmitter you're talking about. When we're talking about agonist versus antagonist effects, we're talking about the effect on the neurotransmitter. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about different drugs and how they affect different neurotransmitters. So these are really common drugs and a couple of uncommon ones just for fun, and how they work on our different neurotransmitter systems. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is GABA. So the first thing you need to remember about drugs that work on the GABA system is that GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It creates IPSPs. When GABA binds to its docking site, it opens an ion channel, it's an ionotropic receptor, it opens an ion channel and chloride comes in. And that acts to hyperpolarize the cell and push it away from action potential. So we have certain drugs that are GABA agonists. These are drugs that increase the effect of GABA. So, for example, benzodiazepines. Dee, can you point at benzodiazepines? Benzodiazepines are one very common kind of drug that is a GABA agonist. That means it does increase the effect of GABA. It makes the cell, the postsynaptic cell, more negative. Any GABA agonist is going to do that. And one very common kind of drug are benzodiazepines that do this. Benzodiazepines, you may have been given some, or you know somebody who's been given some at some time for things like panic disorder or anxiety. Ativan is an example. That's also called lorazepam. And that class of drugs, benzodiazepines or benzos, are also called minor tranquilizers. And they are primarily used for reducing anxiety. So I was given Ativan one time when I went to, the first time I ever had a panic attack, and I went to the emergency room. I didn't know what was happening to me. And they gave me Ativan. And there's actually a binding site for benzodiazepines on your GABA protein complex. This GABA receptor has a site that benzodiazepines fit perfectly into. And so when you take an Ativan, it fits right there into the benzodiazepine site, and it opens up this ion channel, and chloride comes in, it inhibits the cells. And because you have GABA receptors all over your neurons, all over your brain, it decreases the general activity of your brain. And so when your brain, instead of spinning and spinning and spinning, it's able to inhibit all that activity, it's able to inhibit all those action potentials. That's a GABA agonist, and that's what benzodiazepines are. There are many different kinds of GABA agonists though. And another kind of GABA agonists are called barbiturates. And barbiturates are not commonly used anymore. They were very popular in the 60s and 70s before we developed benzodiazepines. An example of one is called Seconal. When people get them not from doctors, they'll often call them downers. And they are a category of drugs called sedative hypnotics. So they're not in the same category as benzos. Barbiturates have their own category. And barbiturates have a completely separate binding site on the GABA complex. There's a place where barbiturates can perfectly also bind to that GABA receptor, and it opens an ion channel, and chloride comes through just like it would for a benzo. But here's the big difference between barbiturates and benzos. Barbiturates, the dosage that gives you relief, that has an effect, is not that much lower than the dose that can put you into a coma or kill you. So that's bad. You know, if you're trying to give somebody who's having anxiety problems a medication to help them with their anxiety, and they take one and then maybe they accidentally take a second, and then now they're feeling very loopy, not thinking very well, they take a third. Now they could kill themselves. And so that's a really dangerous situation, and especially considering things like suicidal ideation with mood disorders. You don't want to give people, if you can help it, drugs where the lethal dose, might be in a bottle of only 5 pills. that can lead to serious situation. Benzodiazepines are not like that. Benzodiazepines, the lethal dosage is dozens to hundreds of times the effective dosage. So you are very unlikely to accidentally overdose from a benzo. I don't recommend trying to. Obviously, you're playing with fire here, but it is a safer drug in that way than barbiturates, and so they're used a lot more now. But they do the same thing. They allow chloride to come in through its channel. Alcohol is also a GABA agonist, and it's also a sedative hypnotic. And there's a binding site for alcohol on the GABA complex as well. And so here's the problem with when people take a couple of these drugs together. When people combine drugs that are GABA agonists, drugs that lower the function of your cells, essentially what you're doing is getting that chloride channel stuck in the open position for way too long. Too much chloride is coming into the postsynaptic cell, and when too much chloride comes into the postsynaptic cell, a couple of things can happen. Number one, you can pass out, okay? So you can lose consciousness because your brain's not working, your cells in your brain aren't firing the way they're supposed to be. Number two, you can lapse into a coma from that. And number three, if it's bad enough, those cells will start to die, and that, enough chloride coming in, enough negative charge, the cell dies. And so that's at very least brain damage, and it can even lead to death. So using drugs synergistically, using drugs where the two effects together are not just 1 + 1, the two effects combine to have an exponential effect, that's a very dangerous thing to do. And if you find a friend in a situation where you're having a hard time getting them to wake up from passing out, that's probably a good time to get them to the ER. It can be a serious, dangerous situation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about acetylcholine. And acetylcholine, the abbreviation for acetylcholine is ACH, just to remind you for what you're putting into your notes. I want to remind you about acetylcholine, that acetylcholine has different kind of receptors that do different things. And one of our acetylcholine receptor types are called nicotinic receptors. And as I've mentioned before, they're called nicotinic receptors because nicotine, like you find in cigarettes or in vape products, some vape products, nicotine is acetylcholine agonist at those nicotinic receptors. And the way it does it, the reason they're called nicotinic receptors is because nicotine acts as a direct ligand for those receptors. So if you smoke and nicotine crosses the blood-brain barrier easily, gets into your brain, it binds right to those nicotinic receptors right where the acetylcholine would normally bind, and it increases the activity of your brain. Those are excitatory receptors. It's opening ion channels for sodium to come in, and it is going to increase your brain activity. That's why people who are addicted to cigarettes feel like, when they don't have nicotine in their system, it's like, oh, your brain is saying, where's my friend? Where's my helper? Where's the little guy who binds to the receptors and lets me work, lets me think, lets me have thoughts? Where is that guy? And so there's an incredible impetus for your brain to go get more of that because it's literally not being able to make its connections like when you usually have nicotine. So the best thing you can do with that is just not use the nicotine in the first place so that your acetylcholine stays in normal balance the way it starts out, and you don't have to worry about withdrawal and missing it when you try to go to quit. But there's another kind of drug that I want to mention that does something different, and that drug is called curare. Okay, so everybody always asks, how do you spell curare? So it's right down there at the bottom of the board, C-U-R-A-R-E, curare. Okay, and curare is in some ways the opposite of nicotine. So nicotine is an acetylcholine agonist. It's a direct agonist. It binds as a ligand and facilitates your brain's use of those acetylcholine neurons. Curare is a powerful acetylcholine antagonist. And in fact, what it does is it blocks the nicotinic receptors. It sits in the nicotinic receptors, but it doesn't activate them. It's like gum in a lock. It doesn't open the lock up at all, but it makes it so you can't put a key in. So whereas nicotine at your neuromuscular junction, when it binds to your nicotinic receptors, even in your peripheral nervous system, it increases muscle rigidity. Any acetylcholine agonist is going to do that, increase muscle rigidity. Curare, though, by blocking those nicotinic receptors at the neuromuscular junction, makes it so that you can't contract your muscles at all. And so what people do who use Curare, it's often used in the Amazon, they put it on the tips of arrows and then they shoot it with a blowgun into whatever animal they want to collect. So, maybe they're hunting for food, or maybe they're hunting to get a parrot or a monkey, something like that. So they'll shoot the animal with the Curare and its muscles go limp. And it kind of falls out of the tree, and then they can collect the animal. And Curare is processed pretty quickly, so that animal, after it gets done processing that Curare, usually turns out none the worse for the wear. And you can have a little parrot on your shoulder, or it's not going to be dangerous if you eat that meat either, if they're hunting for food, obviously. I've also mentioned drugs for Alzheimer's disease. Drugs for Alzheimer's disease, I've talked about a couple of times on how they work on acetylcholine. They are acetylcholine agonists, but they do that job indirectly. They do that job by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. And so it's kind of the enemy is my friend. The guy who stops the guy who breaks me down keeps me in the synapse longer, working as an Alzheimer's drug. And I've covered that a number of times, so I'm not going to go over it again here. Okay, dopamine and drugs that act on the dopamine system. So one of the big famous classes of drugs that work on the dopamine system are antipsychotic drugs. So these are drugs like thorazine and risperidone. They call them neuroleptics, so you may see that word. And in this way that benzodiazepines are minor tranquilizers, antipsychotic drugs are major tranquilizers. And they are used to treat psychotic disorders. So the main psychotic disorder that's lifelong and that people think of when they think of lifelong psychotic disorders is schizophrenia. And as I've mentioned in the previous lectures, schizophrenia has some hallmark features like delusions, where you think things are happening that aren't really happening. So you might believe that you know the person on the television, or you might believe that you're Superman or something like this. These are cliches. It could be anything. And then you can have hallucinations where you actually see, hear, or feel, or even taste or smell things that aren't there. The most common hallucinations are auditory, so you hear voices. And sometimes they can be saying things that you can understand, and sometimes they might not be. But this is a terrifying disorder. And we have a hypothesis that the reason that people have this disorder is because of overproduction of dopamine in their brains. And we have medicines called antipsychotics that can decrease the amount of dopamine that's functioning in your brain. And so in that way, antipsychotics are dopamine antagonists. They decrease the effect of dopamine in the brain. they decrease its activity in the brain. So if what we're talking about with schizophrenia is overactivity of dopamine, we want to give a dopamine antagonist and bring down that overactivity of dopamine. But there's a problem with this because dopamine actually regulates several important things in your brain and in your behavior. And I've mentioned these before. Number one, dopamine pathways are really important for motor function. So Parkinson's disease attacks that dopamine pathway, that nigrostriatal pathway that I've mentioned before. Parkinson's disease attacks that, and so you have motor effects. Well, if a drug affects that pathway, you're also going to have motor effects. And in fact, that was one, when we first started developing, and to this day, honestly, it's still a problem. One of the problems with antipsychotics is that after long-term use, they can have effects on your motor function, and they call it dyskinesia. That literally means bad movement. Dyskinesia, bad movement. And your body is moving outside of your control. And that can be very inconvenient and terrifying. Imagine your body's just kind of flailing all over the place, not under your control. Now you have your delusions and hallucinations under control, but we started to wonder if the cost was worth the benefit. So we have made those drugs so that they target more the mesocortico dopamine pathways, the one from midbrain to cortex, rather than that nigrostriatal pathway, the one that is going from the tegmentum to the basal ganglia. So dopamine, we actually have, I know, at least 5 different kinds of dopamine chemicals. And so we're trying to make drugs that are closer and closer and closer to a structure where they will only fit in the dopamine receptors in that mesocortico pathway and not fit in the very slightly different dopamine receptors in the motor pathway. Because that way a person won't have dyskinesia, but they will have control over their delusions and hallucinations. And some of our second generation antipsychotics seem to be doing that better, though there is controversy in the area. Another drug that works on our dopamine system is cocaine. And cocaine, unlike antipsychotics are dopamine antagonists. They decrease the effect of dopamine in the brain. Cocaine is a dopamine agonist. And the way that it works as a dopamine agonist is it actually inhibits reuptake of the dopamine. And so the dopamine stays in the synapse longer. So cocaine isn't a direct agonist. It doesn't fit into the receptors where dopamine goes. It's an indirect agonist. It blocks the reuptake process, and so that dopamine stays in the synapse longer. Now, what are you going to get if you have a drug in your system that does all the things that I just said schizophrenia does, okay? So it increases your motor activity because it's a dopamine agonist in your motor pathways. And when you see people on cocaine, they're always twitchy and hyper, okay? A lot of motor activity. Increases delusions and hallucinations, goes along that mesocortical pathway and gives you the feeling that you can take on the world. And you'll hear people say these kinds of things, when they're high on cocaine. And of course, the pleasure and reward center, those mesolimbic pathways. Those pleasure and reward centers are very highly active when you're taking cocaine. And so you have that incredible feeling of pleasure and reward. Cocaine is also a norepinephrine agonist. Norepinephrine, NE, right, and dopamine, DA, they both have a very similar chemical structure. I mentioned that they're both called catecholamines. And so they are both of them are affected in an agonistic way by cocaine. And so ask yourself, if you're a doctor, if a person's coming into emergency room, 18 years old, and they're having delusions, hallucinations, and kind of jumping around all over the place, very agitated, are they having their first schizophrenic episode, or are they having their first overdose on cocaine? How would you know as a doctor? You don't until the blood work comes back. And that doesn't work like it does on TV. You don't get blood work back in 5 minutes. It takes a while for them to process your blood and find out whether or not you're high or have schizophrenia. But this is a not uncommon problem in emergency rooms, across the country. All right. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about serotonin and norepinephrine too. So the monoamine neurotransmitters that I've talked about were dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin, and they're all called monoamine neurotransmitters because they are all chemically similar in structure. And I've mentioned before, dopamine and norepinephrine even more so similar than serotonin, so much so that they're in their own group together called catecholamines. But these are all monoamine neurotransmitters. And antidepressants work on these neurotransmitters. Antidepressants work on usually serotonin and norepinephrine specifically. So when we first came up with antidepressants, one of the first antidepressants we came up with was called an MAOI. Now I've talked about MAO before. MAO is monoamine oxidase. So it's the enzyme that breaks down monoamines so that they can be repackaged into vesicles. So you need to have MAO to break down your monoamine neurotransmitters, your dopamine, your serotonin, your norepinephrine in your brain. But I also mentioned that you have this in other parts of your body too, especially large concentrations in your liver of MAO. So the neurotransmitters that we first developed, are the neurotransmitters, the antidepressants that we first developed were for the monoamine neurotransmitters, and they were called MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, okay? So they stopped the monoamine oxidase from breaking down the monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin and norepinephrine especially, and allowed them to have their action for longer. MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. By inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down the monoamines, it keeps them useful for longer. And so that's how they worked. The problem is that, like I said, you also have a lot of MAO in your liver, and you use it for breaking down monoamines in your foods. So a lot of the foods you eat, and this is only related in what's going on in your brain insofar as the chemicals that make up your body are similar all over. So here's your liver using MAO to digest certain foods for you. If you take an MAOI, now your liver can't process those substances. And so some particular things that people couldn't eat when they were taking MAOIs were things like wine and cheese. And it's actually kind of a long list, but people would, refrain. They were asked to refrain from eating those foods, but sometimes they would eat something that they didn't even know had MAO in it. And so, or had monoamines in it. And so here's this monoamine oxidase inhibitor making it so that they can't break down those monoamine foods. They don't even know they're doing it, and now they get sick. But there was one very classic case, and I think they still have it even in the newest edition of the book, of a man who deliberately committed suicide by taking his MAOIs. Obviously, he was very depressed. That's why he's taking the MAOIs. He has a mood disorder. And he decided one night to end it all by eating a big big chunk of cheese and a big bottle of wine, and thought that wasn't such a bad way to go, but it did kill him. His body couldn't process the monoamines in the wine and the cheese, and his liver quit. He had liver failure. So we don't use MAOIs very often anymore, and when we do, they're under pretty strict supervision. Another kind of drug that we used early on were called tricyclics. Okay, so this is spelled like a tricycle, except with X, I-C-S at the end, tricyclics. And they're called that because the shape of the molecule is actually three circles. Okay, so tricyclics, three circles, shape of the molecule. But what they act on is serotonin. So the abbreviation for serotonin is usually 5-HT. So you see that right up here, 5-HT, that's the abbreviation for serotonin. So tricyclics work on serotonin and norepinephrine by blocking reuptake of them and keeping them in the synapse longer. But they had a lot of side effects that people didn't like, and we came up with a new class. We accidentally discovered a new class of antidepressants called SSRIs, SSRI, and that stands for selective serotonin or serotonin specific. It can be either serotonin selective or serotonin specific. Either one, it doesn't matter, it means the same thing. It means this is just for serotonin. A serotonin specific reuptake inhibitor. What do? They block reuptake of serotonin specifically, and they keep it in the synapse longer. You keep it in the synapse longer, you keep it working longer, and it has its effect. And there are very famous SSRIs like Prozac and Zoloft, widely used on the market today. Now, antidepressants, SSRIs, they get to work immediately in your brain. They block reuptake within a short time of you ingesting the medicine, and it has to go through your digestive system, get into your bloodstream, and get through the blood-brain barrier. It goes into your brain, and it blocks reuptake right away as soon as it gets into your brain of serotonin. But the thing is, when you've had mood disorder for long enough that you realize you have it, when you've had bad mood issues going on long enough for you to say, oh wow, this is really a problem, the whole system is damaged by that point. You have been pruning your receptors. You have been decreasing those neurotransmitters in your brain. The system has been breaking down and pruning itself. It's kind of like if we had a highway system going to a big city, and then the big city, people stop going to that big city, well, the highway system starts to fall apart and nobody cares to repair it because nobody's using it. So even though the SSRI works and does its action right away, what needs to happen is all that other stuff needs to be built back up. Those second messages need to be sent to the DNA that says, hey, we're using this neurotransmitter a lot, so we need more. We need you to make more serotonin. We need you to make more receptors for serotonin. We need you to make more transporters for serotonin. We need you to make more vesicles for serotonin. You need to tell the system, hey, start building that stuff again, I'm using it. And so that's why those drugs have what's called a loading time. A period of time when your brain, very baby, starts to rebuild itself. And you can first feel, oh, I feel better. That means that stuff has been working that whole time. It's rebuilding the system. You can also do that through therapy by actually engaging with positive and constructive behaviors, by altering your cognitions, by altering those processes through therapy. You can change what your brain is releasing. You can make it so that you're releasing more serotonin. But it takes the incredibly difficult work that's so hard to do when you're depressed, of getting up and getting out and experiencing those joyful things, those things that bring back meaning into your life and happiness back into your life. And then you use that system and you build it up, you build it up, you build it up. Maybe you use medication and therapy. Now you're cooking with gas, and now you can really build a nice, robust system. And I will say that now becoming more and more common is a class not called SSRIs, but called SNRIs, that work on both serotonin and norepinephrine and block reuptake. So they're similar to the tricyclics, but they seem to have fewer side effects. We're not exactly sure why, but they seem to have fewer side effects, so we use SNRIs now. Not quite as often as SSRIs, I don't think, yet, but definitely, a lot more often than tricyclics. Okay, speaking of your serotonin though, ecstasy, MDMA, is a drug that also works on your serotonin system, and it is also a serotonin agonist. But the way that it is a serotonin agonist is by increasing release of the serotonin. MDMA triggers a massive release, kind of system-wide, of serotonin all over your brain. And so when you release this feel-good chemical into many, many synapses all over your brain, it feels incredibly good. And that's what people are doing when they're rolling on Molly, right? They're experiencing heightened sensation, heightened perception, and definitely skin sensation. These kinds of things, all of this, and elevated mood, because you have serotonin all binding to all receptors all over the place, and it feels great. One of the problems with that is that it's such a massive flood of serotonin that comes into the synapse that you do lose a lot of it to it just diffusing away. Rather than your neurons have a hard time reuptaking that serotonin quickly enough, and so a lot of it just diffuses away and you lose serotonin. And for a person with a healthy brain, it will take their brain a little while to just make more, okay? So, you might feel very depressed mood for a few days after taking it. Another problem with ecstasy is that a lot of times you're not just getting MDMA, you're not getting a pure drug, and you might not even be getting any MDMA at all. You could be getting things like methamphetamines, or other, more dangerous substances. Sometimes they even cut those things with stuff like Clorox, bleach, and obviously that's not good to intake for your body. But a healthy brain, if it's given pure MDMA, would be able to reproduce that serotonin after a bit, unless you had some kind of massive overdose or something like this. Now, for people who don't have normal neurotypical serotonin systems, so a person like me who experiences anxiety, or a person who experiences depression, you might not have very good serotonin system in the first place. And so sometimes these folks will take MDMA and feel almost nothing. And it's because they don't have very much serotonin to be dumping out into the synapse to begin with. So they might feel a slight elevation in mood, but if you've ever been to a party and seen a whole bunch of people and they were all taking the same ecstasy, and everybody's rolling except for that one dude in the corner, I would bet $1 that that one dude in the corner has depression or anxiety or something like that. That is making it so he's not feeling the same effects as everybody else in the room. Okay, so now I'm going to talk just at the very end here about peptide neurotransmitters, your opiates. So this is a really famous class of drugs. It includes everything from heroin to morphine, everything that has COD in it, codeine, oxycodone, OxyContin, even tramadol is in this kind of drugs, these opiate drugs. But all of these drugs work on your endogenous opiate receptors, okay? So you have, like I mentioned last time, endogenous opioids in your body. And these endogenous opioids, we call them endorphins, like endogenous morphine. That's actually what it means. It's a portmanteau. They took endogenous, naturally occurring, and